Hi, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm here today with Dr. Tim McGrew. We're talking about rules of inference. This is actually a new series that we're doing called The Art of Reasoning, where we're going to be looking at certain things about logic and reason. And so today we're looking at, like I said, the rules of inference. We're going to explain what all that is. And actually, Dr. McGrew has a presentation that he's got planned for us today. And we're going to also talk about how this all relates to apologetics, arguments for and against God's existence. He has some really excellent examples to help explain what this concept is, why it's important, how it relates to logic, and, like I said, God's existence. So if you don't know who Tim is, Dr. Tim McGrew is a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. His research interests include epistemology, the history and philosophy of science, and philosophy of religion. He is a specialist in the philosophical applications of probability theory as well. And so this is, like I said, this is a new series we're trying out, and we don't know how many are going to be in the series ultimately, but this is going to be the first one where we're, like I said, we're talking about logic and other really cool things. And this is going to excite the logic nerds among us, like myself and probably everyone who's currently watching this live and people who are watching subsequently. So let's go ahead and get into it. Tim, is there anything that you'd like to add to the introduction that I gave you just now?
Maybe just there's no trigger warning necessary because I've avoided symbols in this talk. So you are not going to be deluged with symbols that are vaguely familiar or unfamiliar. This is all done with words. We show a little structure, but that's all done with English and a few abbreviations. So I think even if you're allergic to the mathy kind of stuff, you shouldn't need to pull out that epinephrine pen and have it handy. You should be okay.
Before we get into the lecture or presentation that you have planned, why don't we talk about why logic, just understanding, having a good understanding of logic, critical thinking, why that is important?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who subscribe to your channel or watch your shows regularly want to know how to persuade other people of things. And that includes both the Christians and the non-Christians. We'd like to be able to persuade each other, right? We think we're right about certain things and things that matter. And to persuade someone with reasons is the best way to persuade someone, because then when you're done, they have those reasons, they've become their own possession. And so that's a stable way to change somebody's mind. Changing their mind with propaganda, not so much. The propagandist goes away or somebody else unmasks the propaganda. That's not a stable and not an ethical way to change somebody's mind. But changing their minds with reasons is a good way. And there's a certain structure to the giving of reasons. Reasons matter for, as if I can put it this way, for reasons. There is an explanation of why it is that some arguments work and other arguments fail. So today, with the topic of the rules of inference, I wanted to cover a few very basic forms of argument that have a certain feature that's very desirable, and then see how that plays out in some of the arguments that we use to try to persuade one another of things.
So go ahead and pull up the slides. And while you're doing that, I want to just let everyone know the structure for today. And while you're pulling it up, once you got it up on the screen, I'll transfer the scene over. There we go. So as you're about to prepare to start the presentation today, I want to let everyone know that we are going to, I'll pull up the scene real quick. We are going to do some Q&A. So after we do the presentation, which is going to last around 30 minutes or so, we're going to do some Q&A. So if you have some questions that pop up in your mind as Dr. McGrew is talking, then make sure to leave them in the live chat. If you send it in as a super chat, it's a whole lot easier for me to find. So just keep that in mind. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So take it away. And if I need to jump in, I will, but I don't anticipate it. So I'll try to keep as quiet as I can.
Okay, so rules of inference. What are we talking about when we talk about rules of inference? I want to just get a little view from a height here, back out for a moment and talk about a broader subject about laws of logic, because we hear this phrase, the laws of logic, sometimes. And there are three principles that often get expressed when we're talking about laws of logic, and they're historically famous. They've been given various formulations. So I just want to touch on those briefly. But first, I want to show you how these things fit together. The laws of logic form a broad category of truths that, as we would say, are necessary truths. These are things that could not be false. Within that broad category, there are some conditional statements that correspond to what we call valid sequence in logic. And these are rules of inference. They're being valid, and we'll talk again briefly about what that term means in a moment, is what qualifies them as laws of logic. So they are within that class. But not all of the laws of logic are rules of inference. We don't use them all when we are inferring, at least not to license the move from one statement to another statement. The rules of inference can be defended. Their corresponding conditionals are necessary truths. Don't worry about it if you don't know what the corresponding conditional is. I'm putting that in there just for the people who know enough to ask the question. So these are rules that can be defended as being logically airtight. We're talking here about deductive logic. The field of non-deductive inference is fascinating. It's rich. It takes us into the realm of probability and explanation and all kinds of other fun things. But you have to get a grip on the basic laws of deductive logic first, because without that, you can't do the probability either. This is the fundamental thing. This is the passkey. This is the point of entry. If you don't come through this door, you can't get to all the other interesting things that are deeper inside the building of philosophy. You've got to pass through this doorway first. So some laws of logic. These are very general, very high-level claims. Again, I'll just give some formulations of them. You can find variant formulations easily enough. The law of identity. Leibniz put it this way: everything is what it is. Sometimes you'll see this expressed as A is A. That's a famous formulation of it. Things are what they are and not something else. The law of identity is not an inference rule for us. It doesn't take us from some premises to some other premises, but it does help us to keep track of what we're talking about so that, for example, we don't equivocate on the meanings of terms. Terms need to mean what they mean and not mean other things that they don't mean. Otherwise, the argument gets all botched by the fact that we're equivocating on the uses of terms. Second famous law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. And a simple way of putting this is a proposition cannot be both true and false. A proposition is just what you mean by a sentence. If I say it's raining, I mean something. If a German friend of mine says es regnet, he is saying something. He's using a different sentence than I am because he's speaking German, but he's expressing the same meaning. So I know at least one person's going to be watching this live stream who will appreciate the German example. Non-contradiction just says you can't have it both ways. You can't have the same proposition being both true and false. A third one is the principle of excluded middle. Every proposition is either true or false. If you have something and it's not true and it's not false, it's not expressing a proposition. It's not the kind of thing that we're dealing with in logic. But the premises and the conclusions of arguments are the sorts of things that can be true or false. And all of them are either true or false. And if you think you have some other category, then you have some kind of ambiguity or semantic variation going on. So those are the laws of logic. These principles are fundamental to clear thinking, but they don't draw us along typically from one proposition to the next. They're not the ones that we invoke as we're making our moves through arguments. So we have to keep them in mind, but for the most part, what we do in deduction is going to be using rules of inference. So that brings us to that special subcategory of laws of logic. And here are just a few. There are many rules of inference, and most logic textbooks give you systems that have redundancy in them. So some of the rules you could actually do without. This is by no means a complete set. It's not even a minimal set that would be expanded only by making things redundant, but these are some typical rules and some rules that I'll be illustrating. One of them is called Modus Ponens. The full name in Latin is Modus Ponendo Ponens, and it means the way through affirming to affirm. Modus Tollens, or Modus Tollendo Tollens, is the way through denying to deny. And something called disjunctive syllogism is an argument where we have an or statement, and then by eliminating some parts of that, we arrive at a conclusion, which is one of the other things in the or statement, the disjunction. So these rules give us a license to draw a specific sort of conclusion from specific kinds of premises. And what I mean by a specific sort or a specific kind there is something in terms of structure. And the beautiful thing about this is that the structure will determine the validity of the argument. If you have a valid inference form, one that's licensed, for example, by one of these rules, then every argument that has that form will be a valid argument. In a previous talk that Cameron and I recorded, I went over 3 checkpoints for deductive argument. I'm just going to do that again really briefly here. We need to make sure when we're making such arguments that the terms are being used the same way throughout the argument. The terms are just the words that are used in the premises, and in particular the non-logical words that give it its content, that flesh out that structure. Is the logical form of the argument valid? If the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion is also true? And third, are the premises true? You can have an argument that's valid but not sound because it has false premises. All the arguments we're going to consider in this presentation are valid. As long as the terms are being used properly, there's no ambiguity or hanky-panky going on with it, they are valid. So their evaluation depends on whether the premises are true. And here's a really important point. Logic by itself usually won't tell you whether the premises are true. Logic will tell you about the structure, whether you can infer one thing from another, whether one thing follows from another, but it will not tell you whether the premises themselves are true unless the premises are themselves matters of logic alone. So anytime that we have any content, any historical or empirical content to an argument, we're using premises that have to be assessed in some other way. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with deductive logic. It might be the right tool to use in a given case. It might not be the right tool to use in a given case, but deductive logic alone will set things up for analysis. The analysis is still up to us. We cannot get around the responsibility that we have to assess the truth of the premises just by being crackerjack logicians. So keep in mind, logic alone isn't going to answer all of the interesting questions. However, it can really help to focus a discussion. It can help us to ferret out ambiguity and to lay something out so that if we disagree with one another, we can point to the exact place where we disagree, and then one hopes focus our attention on those points and perhaps even persuade one another of these things. I realize that on the internet, persuasion is relatively rare, but it does happen. I can tell you I've had discussions with people who have been persuaded by argument and evidence of things they did not come into the discussion believing. And I almost fell off my chair the first time that happened a few years back with somebody who's now a good friend of mine. We don't agree about everything, but I made an argument and he asked me some probing questions about it. I answered his questions and he said, okay, you've convinced me. And that was a beautiful thing. So may his tribe flourish. All right, let's have a look at one of these things. This is the structure for the argument form, the inference form, called modus ponens. So the structure is something that I'll do with just some plugins here. If A, where A is some claim, be it true or false, then B. So that's an if-then statement, or as we say in logic, a conditional. Premise number 2 simply says A, makes the claim that A. Therefore, B. So if those two premises are true, if A then B, A, then B follows. Any argument with this structure is valid. It may not be sound. That depends on whether the if-then statement is true and the claim that A is true. But any argument that has this structure has the property that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. There are some technical points that we could get into here that would be of most interest only to people who already know them. So I'll skip over those. That they largely have to do with the question of the meanings of conditional statements in natural languages and how we model those. If somebody wants to raise a question about that on the live stream, we can do that. But I think most of you can track with what we have here, and I just want to move on now and show you some examples where we fill out the structure. So here is a classic example that is used in a lot of logic classes and philosophy classes. If Socrates is a man, so there's the A, then Socrates is mortal. That latter part is the B. Socrates is a man, says premise 2. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So the first claim is the if-then. The second claim asserts the left-hand part of it. The conclusion is the right-hand part of it. This has the structure of modus ponens. If the premises are true, the conclusion also has to be true. Now, there's a related form of argument that's not strictly a modus ponens, although working it through in symbolic logic would involve our stripping it down and then using the modus ponens form of inference. But you may see arguments of this form. All S are P. Everything that is an S is a P. A, some particular thing, is S. Therefore, A is P. So again, if we're sort of expanding this in natural language, I'll just put this out parallel to it. Take anything you like. We might say, if it has property S, then it has property P. The particular thing A has property S. Therefore, the particular thing A has property P. Now, strictly speaking, this is not modus ponens because we have that all at premise 1. But if you're sharp, you scan the right-hand side, the sort of translation I've given you here, and you say, but I see an if and a then in the right-hand side. It's just that I have this anything out to the left of it. And you're right, that is a conditional buried inside of it. Learning how to do this all in symbols, learning what these things are called. The technical name is quantifiers, the for all or there exists some. And the S and the P here are playing the role of predicate letters, and we play with that endlessly in a symbolic logic class. We have just too much fun with that. That's all something that you can do if you're taken with this subject. You say, wow, okay, I really need to dive in and to know everything there is to know about making valid arguments. You definitely want a logic class that lies in your future. So if you're already seeing this, then you know this is where you want to go. That's great. I've done something for you in today's talk. Maybe you would rather just stay at the level of the verbal instances. So let me give you an example of an argument that has this form that's related to modus ponens, and then let me show you something cool. All right, so here is a version of the first few steps in the Kalam cosmological argument. For some of you, this is old news. You've already seen this. Whatever begins to exist is caused to exist by something else. That whatever at the beginning of this, that is our quantificational term. That's equivalent to the for all or the take anything you like kind of thing. Whatever begins to exist is caused by something to exist by something else. Premise 2, the physical universe began to exist. Therefore, conclusion on line 3, the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. I'm going to seize the opportunity here to tell you one of my pet peeves. And this is something that even good authors do, but it annoys me as a logician. You'll notice that the way that I've laid this argument out, and everywhere else throughout this entire talk, the therefore comes between two of the numbered lines. It is not on one of the numbered lines. This is a matter of good logical hygiene. The therefore is expressing a connection between what's on some of the lines and what's on another line. It's not part of the content of any of the lines. I know it's common for people to put it on a line, like put it on line 3. And all I can say is if you do that, please don't tell people that you've watched this, because you shouldn't do it.
Tim,
All
you
right.
should be pleased to hear that I have, since I saw you actually talk about that, I have not done it. And I think some people have been like, where's the therefore? And so where do you actually, do you always just do it on a separate line, or do you do it like, period after the proposition in 2, and then so?
You can just put a horizontal line in between the premises and the conclusion you're drawing from them. That's also a convention. So you can put 3 dots out to the left of the line number, although if you're using bullet numbers in PowerPoint, then it's hard to do that. So, but just don't put it on the numbered line. Thank you, Cameron. I have not lived in vain. This is good.
Yeah, no.
All right.
So for like the past 2 years, I've been abiding by that rule. So thank you for that.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. So here's an interesting point about this argument, though. If you look at the premises and the conclusion, the premises are logically stronger than they have to be to give us this conclusion. The first premise is universal. Whatever begins to exist is caused to exist by something else. I don't actually need that universal premise to draw the conclusion. Now, it may be that the universal premise is true. It may be that it's something that people see immediately. But actually, we can strengthen the argument, steelman the argument, by substituting for premise 1 here a logically weaker claim that still gets the job done. And in doing it, we transform this argument into an instance of that inference form that we began with, modus ponens. If, notice just if, if the physical universe began to exist, then the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. The physical universe began to exist, therefore, the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. So now this is just an if-then statement, and then the left-hand side of it on line 2, and the right-hand side of it on line 3. So what we've done is to streamline the argument into a modus ponens, and now premise 1 isn't framed universally, and so it's not subject to counterexample. So some people, I think wrongly, believe that examples from quantum mechanics are counterexamples to the stronger statement of the premise on the previous slide. Be that as it may, even if they were right, they are not counterexamples to this premise. So by lightening the logical claim, we have circumvented a certain approach to trying to criticize the premise, because the premise doesn't claim as much, and yet, because this is a valid argument form, the argument goes through as stated. So that's an example of a way that we can use basic rules of reasoning. Think about an argument, ask ourselves, do we really need to make that bold of a claim in order to get the conclusion? And then streamline those arguments so that they claim the minimum amount necessary for us to be able to use the other premises and infer the conclusion we want. So that's just a kind of a cool trick. So even if you had already been familiar with modus ponens, you might not have seen that one before. How about modus tollens? Here's the structure of a modus tollens. Again, I'll just lay this out simply. If A, then B, that's exactly like the first premise of a modus ponens. But now, remember, modus tollens is the way through denying to deny, modus tollendo tollens, not B. So this is the claim that B is false, therefore not A. That's our structure. And again, anything with that structure will be valid. So here's an example of an argument that has a modus tollens structure and is therefore valid. If I remembered to put the sugar into the brownies, the batter will taste sweet. The batter does not taste sweet. Therefore, I did not remember to put the sugar into the brownies. This is an example actually drawn from life. Fortunately, it was discovered before the pan of brownies was put into the oven, so the sugar did get added and the brownies came out great in the end. But it's a very simple, humorous example of an argument structure that we can fit together with what we saw in the previous slide. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. That example does not make anyone's heart beat higher unless you're really into brownies, but let's move on to an example that may be of more interest to some people who are watching this live stream. If metaphysical naturalism is true, then there are no objective moral facts. There's an if-then statement. There are objective moral facts. Therefore, metaphysical naturalism is false. You might wonder why the word not doesn't appear on line 2, because it does in the Modus Tollens thing, and you'd be right to say, hey, wait, didn't you skip over something there? We did, and I'll talk about that again when I give another example. This is a very common thing that philosophers do. They use what's called a double negation step. Strictly, I would need, it is not the case that there are no more objective moral facts, and then I'd do a double negation and I'd get what's on line 2 here, but we skip over that. And so this argument has a valid structure. Is it sound? Well, logic won't tell you that. Are the premises true? Is the if-then statement true? I can find metaphysical naturalists who think it's true, and I can give you arguments that premise 1 is true, but that remains to be done. Merely laying it out in a valid form doesn't accomplish that. Same thing with premise 2, that there are objective moral facts. Many people would simply deny this. I think that's an awkward position to hold, and I would argue against it, but I would have to argue against it. Simply laying the argument out does not constitute a defense of the premises. I'm merely showing you the structure. Here's a third example. If God exists, then there are no inscrutable evils, evils for which it is impossible to see any morally sufficient reason. But there are inscrutable evils. Therefore, God does not exist. So if you were cheering on the previous example, then maybe this one will not strike you as being as much fun, and vice versa. If you didn't like the previous one, maybe you'll like this one better. This is a version of the problem of evil, and exactly the same thing holds here. It has a structure that is valid. Now we need to ask, are the premises true? So logic will tee this up for us, but we still have to take a swing and drive the ball down the fairway. We cannot simply say, I set it up as a valid argument, my work is done. No, that's the point at which you get on to the next part of the work. So again, note the silent move from there are inscrutable evils to it's not the case that there are no inscrutable evils. We need that, and then we get the conclusion by Modus Tollens. So there's that little silent use of a double negation in there. So we've done Modus Ponens, we've done Modus Tollens, and there are other Modus Tollens arguments that will occur to you. If you want more examples, I can bring those up later. I don't want to talk about another form here, and this is a form that sometimes goes by the name disjunctive syllogism. Don't be put off by the big multisyllabic names. Here's a simple version of it, either A or B. Not A, therefore B. Very simple form of argument. Often, when we're interested in using this kind of reasoning, we have a slightly more complicated argument. Instead of an either or, we have an either or, either A or B or C. Not A, not B, therefore C. Whoops, got the line numbering wrong on that one. Just forgot to correct that one in PowerPoint. So that slightly extended form is clearly closely related to the simpler disjunctive syllogism. There are arguments that you're familiar with in apologetics and philosophy of religion that have the latter form, the latter structure. To evaluate them, though, we've got to ask some pressing questions. Are the alternatives A, B, C, are they jointly exhaustive, or have we overlooked some possibilities? It's very important that we make sure, if we're making an argument like this, that the options we're presenting are the only options or the only live options, and we really have to make that case. Have we logically eliminated the alternatives, or have we merely shown that they fit poorly with the available evidence? This one is important because if the latter, then there's a third question that arises. Have we checked to make sure there are not similar objections to the remaining alternative? I mean, if I say A or B or C, and then I make an argument that A and B both fit poorly with the evidence, and along comes somebody else who says, yeah, but you know what, C fits poorly with the evidence as well. Well, then we're not in a position to jump to C because C is in the same boat as A and B. And now we need other considerations to tell us, did we make a mistake initially? Were those not the only options? Or did we misevaluate one of these things? Or is this just a case where a funny coincidence has occurred one way or another and we can't tell which way it is from this evidence alone? We have to ask that question. So it becomes especially clear when we're evaluating disjunctive syllogisms that we have to be careful about whether we're enumerating all the possibilities and whether we're really eliminating the alternatives, or at least showing that some of the alternatives suffer from demerits that the one remaining one does not. We really have to be very careful in using the deductive structure. So here's an example of an argument that's very famously got this structure. It's Lewis's trilemma. Either Jesus was a liar, or he was a lunatic, or he was the Lord. He was not a liar. He was not a lunatic. Therefore, he was the Lord. That's got a tight structure deductively, but all those questions about evaluation that we asked, we have to bring back in. I don't propose here to do that. I'm almost out of time for this presentation, but I want to just show you one way of thinking about the question of the first premise. Why are those the only three options? So to do this, I'm going to go back to the laws of logic, and I'm going to show you how we can construct a little tree diagram. It's called a tree of porphyry, for those who want a name for everything, that will help us to sort out the options and to see how they're defined and how they fall out of this logically. So let's Steelman the trilemma. We have to start with something that Lewis takes for granted. He doesn't bother to argue it. He thinks it's too obvious to be worth arguing, that Jesus claimed to be divine, in effect at least, by assuming divine prerogatives. Either this was true, that he was divine, or it was false. Let's suppose that it was false. Then one of two things is the case. Either he knew that it was false, or he did not know that it was false. If it was false and he knew it, then he was a liar. That's what that part of the trilemma means. If it was false and he did not know that it was false, then he was crazy. He thought that he was divine, and that's about as ridiculous a claim as a mortal man can make. That's really way out there. But if neither of those is the case, then the claim was true. Because if it was false, either he knew it or he didn't. Do you see how at each branch we're separating things according to whether a given proposition is true or false? And we're using here the principles of non-contradiction and excluded middle to give structure to it so that we can see what the alternatives in the trilemma amount to. We still have to answer questions about the truth of the other premises, but I think this is the best way of going about laying out the logical structure that underlies the trilemma. Some of you want to know about more advanced rules of inference. I'm not going to talk about these, but I'm just going to list a few things to whet your appetite so that if you want to rush out and do more logic, you know where to go. Predicates and what we call first order quantifiers, all terms and some terms that range over some domain of things that we define. That is the subject in your first symbolic logic course. course that you'll get. It's usually an upper level undergraduate course in college. If you want to go on and do graduate work in philosophy, in any good program, you will be required already to have had some exposure to first order predicate logic. So that's a first place to go if you want to dive into this deeply. Then there are second order quantifiers. And these range not just over the elements of the domain, but over predicates that span the domain. So we need these to express things like Leibniz law. And if you don't know what Leibniz law is, then you probably don't care right now. That's okay. Modal operators, like it is necessary that, and it is possible that. There's a lot of really interesting work that's done in modal logic. Some of it is tied up with interesting claims in metaphysics. And there are multiple modal systems. There are whole hierarchies of modal systems, even just with alethic operators, with operators having to do with truth and falsehood. And then there are quasi-modal systems about obligation and permissibility and other kinds of notions that are also governed by quasi-modal operators. And finally, one of my favorites is a system called protothetic that lets you extend quantifiers so that you can do self-refutation arguments. So that if someone says it can be proved that nothing can be proved, you can use this system to show that what he has said must be false. That isn't something you can do with ordinary predicate logic or even second order predicate logic. It's not something you can do just by adding modal operators, but it is a really fun system to play with all in its own right. So that's for the geeks, the more advanced rules of inference, and there's all kinds of fun subtopics that we could get into there. But at this point, I'm going to stop the screen share and come back to Cameron and let him see if I can get my...
Yeah, just pull your video up there.
Okay, yeah, I've stopped the sharing, and I'm trying
No worries.
to
While you're doing that, I'll just let everyone know that we are about to do some Q&A. So we already had one come in, and actually, let's go ahead and do that one now. And then as we start to answer this one, if you have questions for Tim, then go ahead and just leave it in the live chat. You can tag me, or you can send it in as a super chat. That helps out the ministry and also helps make sure that your comment and your question will be asked today. So here's Aaron Hansen. He says, does deductive logic bring about new knowledge? It seems to conclude things we already believe. Apart from AI engineering, there's not much practical use.
Yeah, this is a fun question because you can see how if the conclusion of a deductively valid argument must be true, supposing the premises to be true, then if you know the premises are true and you're smart enough, you should already be there with a conclusion. So how can it be the case that deductive logic brings about new knowledge? Bertrand Russell, who's a great 20th century philosopher, has a funny example of how this can do it. He tells the story of a political meeting where the politician in question was running late, and so a priest who's at the meeting decides to just sort of say a few words to keep people interested, keep them from wandering away. And he says to them, I've been a priest for many years, but the most notorious thing that ever happened to me, my very first time when I was taking confession, my very first person in the confessional booth confessed to a terrible crime. And he goes on like this for a few minutes. Finally, the politician rushes in. Sorry, I'm late. Oh, Father so-and-so, so good to see you here. Father so-and-so probably doesn't remember me, but I was the first person to do confession with him. So there we got a place where suddenly the two pieces of information come together, and now everybody knows more than they should know about the politician. So Russell gave this as an example of a case where deduction can lead us to some new knowledge. But of course, that's only because we're newly informed of the premises and then we put them together. I think maybe the more serious question is, are human beings deductively omniscient? And the answer is clearly no. We fail to balance our own checkbooks. So guiding someone to see the consequences of some beliefs is one of the ways to take people without even necessarily giving them new information and lead them to new knowledge, because they just don't see the consequences of their beliefs yet. And so you can help them by walking them through an argument. Sometimes that works. I've seen things like that work with people who've granted me certain premises. They don't really see the conclusion. And then you take them step by step through it, and at the end, they see it. So I think that can happen, but it's a bit of a paradox that has been raised about logic. And I think the key to that is just that humans fail to see the consequences of their own beliefs sometimes, but logic can help with that.
Yeah, that reminds me of like an objection to the use or utility of deductive arguments that I've heard from Dr. Graham Oppy, something along the same lines. So yeah, and I think the answer there is right. It's like sometimes we just can't see what our beliefs imply.
Right. So here's a fun one from one of the older philosophers. There was a philosopher who was set to give some lectures on logic, and just as he was getting ready to go, so he was getting paid for these, right? This is how the guy makes a living. One of the people in the audience called out, "Prove to me that logic is useful." And he said, "Oh, you want me to prove that logic is useful?" "Yeah, prove to me that it's useful." "Okay. And if I'm going to prove it, I'd better give you an argument, right?" "Yeah, give me an argument that logic is useful." "And if I give you an argument, it's going to have to be a good argument, right?" "Yeah, give me a good argument that logic is useful." "Okay. And how will you know whether I'm bullshitting?" And when the other guy has no answer, he says, "You see how useful logic is? Without it, you can't even tell whether logic is useful or not."
That's pretty good. All right, here's a question, and I don't know how to pronounce this name because it looks like it's in some other language. It says, can Dr. McGrew speak a bit about intuitionistic logic? I always have a hard time understanding it. Thank you so much.
Right. So there are a number of systems that are called logics that have some alternative rules. And I think that typically when you've got a system that's got alternative rules, you find out that's because it's got alternative meanings. Some of the meanings of terms have been changed. In intuitionistic logic, one of the simplest ways of thinking about intuitionist logic is to think of it as substituting the notion of provability instead of the notion of truth. So where in logic we ask, if this is true and this is true, is this other thing true? Here we're asking about provability. Now, in mathematics, there are limitations to provability. There are some things that just can't be proved. We know that in any formal system that can be expressed in set theory and is finitistic, there will be true mathematical propositions that are not consequences of the axioms. This is basically a short way of expressing one of the Gödel incompleteness results. So in intuitionistic logic, we ask, all right, but what can be proved or disproved? But then there are things that can be neither proved nor disproved. So unlike truth and falsehood, where there's just no middle ground, in intuitionistic logic, we change the semantics, then we're dealing with some things that have this intermediate space, this middle ground in between. And in that case, yeah, there's scope for our saying these things are neither provable nor disprovable. That's interesting. It's not really a rival, though, to classical logic. And when people try to express it as a rival to classical logic, I think they're making a mistake. And that mistake can lead people to thinking that there are alternatives to the laws of logic. And I think that's a rabbit trail down which many people have gone. I think people were confused, some by Quine in his paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and other papers. But ultimately, I think Quine's arguments are unpersuasive, and there really are no alternatives in the strong and interesting sense of alternatives to the basic laws of classical bivalent logic. You can change the meanings, and then you can do some other things with those changed meanings, but you're not really talking about rival systems.
All right, here's a question, a very good question from Dave Dice. He says, please ask Tim any book recommendations for studying logic for complete beginners. Thanks for all your work.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of logic textbooks that are out there on the market right now. And if you go to someplace like ABE Books, looks like Abe Books, you will find that they have, they're a consortium of thousands of used booksellers. Used logic texts are literally going for little more than the postage that it pays to mail them to you. So you could get Irving Kopey's logic textbook. He's got an introduction to logic. Patrick Hurley has one. David Kelly has one. There's one by Bergman that's a good one. There are just lots and lots of good basic logic textbooks out there. If you have questions specifically about one that you know that you can get cheap or that you already have, and you want to know whether it's a good one, send me a Facebook note. I will respond to that and I will tell you. But I would say any decent major logic textbook now is a good place to start, and you can pick up with that and then you can move on. A lot of them are decent for teaching yourself. I wound up teaching myself symbolic logic because when I did my undergraduate degree, there was nobody actually teaching the course in question. So they had an option to get credit by examination, and they handed me a textbook and said, study this, and then we'll give you a test. And if you can pass the test, then you get credit for this undergraduate logic course, which is what I did. But that's a hard way to do an entire course. But you can get a lot of knowledge through self-studies. That's, I would say, any decent textbook, any of the ones I've named, David Kelly's Art of Reasoning, Kopey's Introduction to Logic, Hurley's Concise Introduction to Logic. There are many, many, many more.
Excellent. So I wanted to remind everyone, if you're watching this and you're enjoying the content so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the little notification bell so you can get notifications when we post new videos. It's really important to do that. It helps us out. And just, do it. Also, give it a thumbs up. We're at 59 likes right now. We need to get up. We're at like 125 people watching live right now. So hit the thumbs up button. Helps us out. Helps engagement and YouTube analytics, all that good stuff. Okay, so I want to ask you, Tim, what percentage of professional philosophers that you are familiar with, or if you know the statistic, then just go ahead and feel free to give it to me. What percentage of philosophers would you say deny the law of non-contradiction?
I don't have a statistic on hand. Going anecdotally from my experience, the number is not very high. And for those who do, the number who actually mean by it the same thing that the rest of us mean by it is vanishing. So I do remember one distressing episode in graduate school where there was another graduate student. She was into continental philosophy. I was one of the analytics. This was at Vanderbilt University in the war years when we had the department split pretty much down the middle between the analytics and the continentals. And we went over to the cafeteria for lunch to talk about these things. And she said to me, what you need to understand is that in continental philosophy, those three laws of logic, non-contradiction and excluded middle, and I can't remember the third one, but I have it written down somewhere, they don't hold. That was not an impressive selling point for continental philosophy. So, so you can find some people on the postmodern wing of things who will try to deny this. I think they have often really not even crossed the pons asinorum of the subject. I'm not persuaded that most of them even know in basic terms what we're talking about. Quantum logics and other kinds of attempts to give a rationale for funky logics, those are more interesting, but again, in the end, I don't think that they wind up actually being rivals to classical bivalent logic.
Yeah, so here's a question. This is kind of related to this. ML Piana says, Dr. McGrew, why do some philosophers deny the law of non-contradiction?
Some of them deny it because it sounds cool and edgy to deny things that are obviously true. Some of them deny it because they think they've seen a counterexample, although I would argue that the counterexamples that they've seen actually just aren't really counterexamples. Maybe they've been tricked by some semantic sleight of hand into thinking that they're counterexamples. Some of them think that that's the only way to make sense of some empirical work in quantum mechanics, for example. I think that that's just a mistake, and that if you look into the quantum logics thing, you discover that in the end, there's just no there there. Some of them don't really mean law of non-contradiction the way that classical bivalent logic means it, and so they will say that they're denying the law of non-contradiction, but really they're giving some semantic alterations that mean that they're saying things that are not incompatible with classical logic, but they think that those things are interesting and they want to call it a denial of bivalence or a denial of the law of non-contradiction or one of these other kinds of things. And so that's the short answer. There's a couple of different paths to making an utterance like that. The best thing probably is just to stop somebody who's saying that and say, tell me what you mean. I know that there are some Christians who think that the laws of logic are in place only because God has decided that these shall be the laws of logic, and God could decide to make them not be the laws of logic. I don't think that even means anything. So when I hear people say that, I get really perplexed and I worry about them.
All right, here's a really good question from Maverick Christian, and this one might be the one that we end on today. He says, what is your solution to this sentence is false, if not dialetheism?
Right, so dialetheism is the position that some sentences express in the same sense and at the same time both a truth and a falsehood. So I would say the solution that I would favor would be to say that's not even expressing any proposition. That set of words appears to express a proposition, but it doesn't express a proposition, and therefore doesn't express either a true proposition or a false proposition. And that is probably the main way of approaching the liar and similar paradoxical statements, although it's not the only way of approaching it. So that, I think, is probably the solution that most philosophers and logicians would give you. There are fancy, interesting discussions of this, but that would be my take on it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on today to do this on Rules of Logic. What would be another good topic to do in the future in the same vein?
We've started talking about deductive logic. The next logical topic to cover would be some non-deductive inferences, including explanatory inference and its connections to probability. And especially, I think, some of the mistakes that we're most liable to make when we make non-deductive arguments. There are certain pitfalls that people seem to walk straight into time and time again. And so, for example, we could talk about Occam's razor and the principle of preferring simplicity in explanations when those explanations are adequate. The question of chain arguments, where you need A and B, and then you need C, and then you need D, and we have this long chain, and then down at the end you get a conclusion. And what could go wrong with a chain argument? Arguments from silence, where we say, well, we don't have this bit of evidence, and then we draw the conclusion that some event didn't take place. There are cognitive fallacies, focusing on an objection when, if you don't have an answer to that objection, that's not necessarily fatal to your position. Maybe there are other good reasons for holding your position, even if you are working within an unfinished framework and you don't have what psychologists like to call cognitive closure regarding the particular issue that you're hung up on. That's a big one for some people. The illicit demand for absolute certainty, where it's just not possible, that's a big issue. So there's all kinds of interesting things we could talk about in that vein.
Excellent. Well, let's do it. Let's do some non-deductive logic arguments, inferences. That would be great. All right. Well, let me go ahead and address the audience real quick. So if you enjoyed this today and you would like to see more of Dr. Tim McGrew giving you kind of a lesson on an introduction to logic and reasoning and argumentation and probability, we actually are in the middle of doing a 12 apologetics courses for beginners, and we've already recorded the episode or the course with Dr. Tim McGrew, and that one is number 2, Logic, Argumentation, and Probability. So all of the ones that you see checkmarked here are available right now, except for Pascal's wager at the very end. That will actually be available tomorrow. But the other courses here that are marked with a check, these are all available right now at patreon.com/ patreon.com/capturing Christianity. Go ahead and put that up here on the screen. It's also linked in the description of the video, and you can get access to these 12 courses. You can support the ministry. You can also gain access to the Bereans, which is a private Facebook group for patrons of Capturing Christianity. It's an amazing group. We have amazing discussions, a lot of really cool things. I share stuff behind the scenes, new live streams that we have planned coming up that no one else knows about, and you can also gain access to really cool Bereans gear. I even just bought a face mask for the first time. Let me go ahead and put it on. Look at that. I don't know if you can hear me, but there it is. I can't wait to wear this. It just came in the mail. It's really cool. All right. Well, anyways, yeah. So support the ministry. Go to patreon.com/capturing Christianity to do that. And thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget that Christianity is true. See you guys later.